concentration increasing. Some of you had some ideas, some of you just didn't care, don't care, don't care, don't care, I don't care. So let's find out if any of you actually care. Let's Sir and then Sir in the back. What does industrial production mean? All right, so burning of fossil fuels in your answer is increasing over time. Can you read that? In the back. Can you read this?
Can I read it? No, I can know. Wait, what? He's fighting so angrily.
Increased burning of fossil fuels because of the way that our lives have been changing over the past few decades. More factories, as he was saying, that are burning fossil fuel, more cars, etc. So as you burn more fossil fuels, more CO2 in the atmosphere, the concentration is going up. So I always bring this up when people mention fossil fuels. A few years ago, there was an estimate number of cars per number of individuals in countries around the globe. And the number for the US, this was almost 10 years ago, was for every 1,000 people in the US, there were 1,300 cars. So more than one per person. In the same time period, looking at an industrialized country in Europe, like France. When you think France, you don't think third world country, you think first world. For every 1,000 people in France, there were only 700 cars, so less than one per person. And in the same time period, so again, this is almost 10 years ago, for every 1,000 people in China, how many cars do you think there were? Actually, it was 11. It has gone up significantly since then because the middle class in China has grown a lot in the past few years, and as the wealth goes up, people tend to want American-style lives, which means bigger houses, bigger cars, more cars, wasteful life, styrofoam everywhere, trash that you throw everywhere like Americans do, so not so great. Yes, sir. I'm sorry? I don't remember the number for India. Yes, sir.
Aren't there numbers, like more recently, there's a lot of population where pollution comes from China?
So recently, China has overtaken the US in terms of the amount of pollution they put into the air. And people have been complaining about that, but you have to remember that the population of China is 4 times the population, almost 4 times the population of the US. So we have 300 and something million people in the US, and our pollution levels, our pollution production was more than what China used to do with more than 1.2 billion people. And now we complain that, ooh, they pollute more than we do, but they have 4 times as many people. And they barely pollute more than we do now. And most of their pollution is industrial pollution for things they produce and they sell to us. So that pollution is for the stuff you are consuming, most of it. Most things are made in China these days. And there's also pollution for transporting them across the ocean to get them to the US. So you have to add that pollution on top of the industrial pollution. So anyway, so yes, lots of burning of fossil fuels means steady increases in the CO2 concentration over time. Any other reasons? Hold on. There was Sir in the back, and then we come back to the front. Yes, Abdulaziz. All right, so deforestation has been increasing over time. And as you cut down the trees, they're taking less CO2 out of the atmosphere, which means the concentration in the atmosphere is going up. And when you cut down the trees, you're not just cutting them down. In many places, when you cut them down, is for agricultural reasons. So you're replacing the forest with an agricultural field, a crop, instead of what the trees used to be. So this is where I sidetrack and talk to you about the special type of agriculture called slash and burn agriculture. I mean, if you were cutting down the trees to make furniture, yes, you're removing the trees so they're not taking up as much CO2 out of the atmosphere, but at least the CO2 that they had taken up in the past is stored in the wood, and that is not being released back into the atmosphere. When you do slash and burn, you're cutting down the trees and then you're burning them. So not only are you removing the plants that would be taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, you're burning the plant, which means you release the CO2 back to the atmosphere that they had already taken out years ago. So if you think of a tropical rainforest, it's a very complex system. And you have your really tall trees, and then you have your shorter trees, and then you have these vines that grow on top of the trees, and then you have little plants at the base of the forest, and then you have other plants growing on top of the forest, which we call epiphytes. So you have multiple layers of plants, very complex system. Now, the tropical rainforest gets plenty of precipitation, and most of the rain that falls in here is going to run off. And as it does that, it's going to leach out the nutrients from the soil. So the soil has been subjected to this intense rain for hundreds of thousands of years. And so there's basically no nutrients left in the soil. And yet there are all these trees growing there, all these plants growing there, and they're very, very productive. So how does that work? One thing you have to remember is that there's always nutrient recycling in a forest. And tropical rainforests are really good at nutrient recycling. So if there's any dead material, either leaves falling out of a tree or animals eating the plants and then discharging their waste products, any leftover organic matter that falls onto the forest floor, it's almost immediately decomposed by fungi because it's warm, it's humid. Very quickly that's decomposed, and the nutrients are taken up by the roots of the trees almost immediately. So those nutrients do not last on the forest floor for a long time. So the trees take it up, dead parts fall off, animals eat them, they excrete organic waste. All of that dead material and organic waste gets recycled very quickly. So the nutrients are continuously recycled. They're not in the soil. So if you want to grow crops here, well, you can't grow crops with all these big trees around. So what industrialized agriculture folks in the tropical rainforest regions do is they come and cut all this down. Just cut down everything. And then you burn it. And when you burn these plants, what are you left with? When you burn the logs in your fireplace, what are you left with? Ash. And what's so special about that ash as far as agriculture is concerned? All the minerals are concentrated in the ash. So this is a great source for minerals because you took the minerals of an entire tree, burned all the carbon compounds into CO2 into the atmosphere, and concentrated the minerals in the ash. Great cheap fertilizer. And then you put this on the soil. And then you grow your crop. So what are you typically growing? Corn. So here's my cornfield. Not a very complex system. And then what do you do with the corn? You harvest it, you don't recycle it, which means you remove the nutrients from the system when you harvest your crop. So when you harvest your crop, all the nutrients from the ash that you put on top of the soil is now gone. How many times can you grow corn here? A couple of times, maybe 3 times, and then you run out of nutrients. Then what? You go somewhere else and burn more trees and start from scratch again. And in the meantime, when the corn was growing there, was it taking up as much CO2 out of the atmosphere as the forest was? No, why not? There are smaller plants, there are fewer of them, you don't have that many layers, it's not as efficient, because here the top layer is using intense sunlight, then you have intermediate levels of sunlight, and then low levels of sunlight. So all of these plants are specialized for using different amounts of light, and they're all photosynthesizing. When you get to the corn, it's the same height, basically. They grow up at the same amount of time, and they grow for a short period of time, for a few months, and then you harvest them. So for some of the time, the land doesn't even have any plant cover, because you have to wait for the corn to germinate and grow to a certain height, and then you harvest it, and then it's bare again for a little while. Yes, sir?
That was my question, was how much the canopy layer plays into affecting the land.
So in terms of the tropical rainforest, you don't worry about the moisture as much as if you're in the subtropical regions with the dry season. So during the dry season, you might have to worry about that. And the dry season there, depending on where you are, it could be a time when you actually don't plant a crop. But you also have to worry about the nutrients. You're not recycling the nutrients, so after 2 or 3 times of this, you can't grow corn there anymore. Corn requires a lot of fertilizer. So if you actually ever go to the Midwest and go to the cornfields, they provide a lot of fertilizer to those cornfields. Or if you go to upstate New York, it's either chemical fertilizers for corn so that they can feed the cows, or it's manure, in some cases when you're dealing with organic farms, and it's the cow manure that is used for fertilizer for the corn, and then you cut the corn and feed the cows. So at least there's a little recycling there with the cow manure, but if you're relying on chemical fertilizer, there's no recycling. And in the tropical rainforest, they don't want to pay for the chemical fertilizer, because that's expensive. You burn the trees, a lot cheaper. So 2 problems. The corn is not photosynthesizing as much as the forest, so you don't take up as much CO2 out of the atmosphere, and you burn these trees. You release all that CO2 that was stored as wood in these trees back into the atmosphere. So it took a couple of 100 years for this tree to grow, so 200 years worth of carbon stored as wood. In a matter of minutes, you burn it, you release it to the atmosphere. So deforestation, in terms of agricultural land and slash and burn agriculture, is really, really bad for the CO2 problem. Of course, you can't just go to Brazil and tell the people who are doing this in the tropical rainforest, stop. Why can't you do that?
All of Vermont, from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, 200 years ago. So I always find it ridiculous when we go to third world countries and tell them that they can't clear cut their forests when we exist. I mean, I prefer that we don't. Let it happen, but at the same time.
Yeah, so do we have the moral authority to tell them, don't do this if this is the way they're providing subsistence living for the people? And he's correct that when the colonists first started colonizing the US, and then when they moved out to the Midwest, they cut down the forest. And most people think of the Midwest as being prairie. And that's true of parts of the Midwest, like Nebraska. Nebraska and Kansas, those were tall grass prairie, and they were plowed and planted with crops. But if you go to a place like Ohio, New Yorkers think Ohio is the Midwest prairie.
No.
Ohio is not prairie. As far as the ecology of Ohio is concerned, Ohio is part of the northeastern deciduous forest. So Ohio was 95% forested before white settlers arrived in the early 1800s. By 1900, Ohio was less than 10